At first, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Zsolt Babak, and I work for Webtown, as Eddie already said. I would like to introduce our company first. We are a Liferay Platinum partner as Webtown, and we work for many, many companies in our country. We have more than 5 years of experience in enterprise setups and a lot of customers from financial sectors and various sectors in various industries. I'm at the company since we started Java development, so I've been involved in all of the projects we did before, and since every project then. Now, I will give you in this presentation a template for our configurations, and I will explain why we change various settings. So basically, I will give you a PortalX property template, and I will explain why we change various settings in it. This is what I will be talking about today. So let's start it. First, the architecture independent settings. Everyone should be quite familiar with that. There is not too much to say about it. I've included them here because they are written in the database when the database is initialized, and they are hard to change later. You can change the administrator username or email address and every other aspect of the settings in the control panel, but not these. I highlighted locals enabled because usually people tend to leave that at the default setting, and that's not really a good practice, and I will show you why. This setting causes the portal to generate various alternatives to all of the enabled languages in the portal, which is not shown by default to the users. They are in the meta the head section of the page at the meta headers, but crawlers and robots will usually crawl these pages, and will cause a lot of performance issues if you have caching issues. They will show up when all of your web content is optimized for 1 or 2 languages, but you have more than 10 enabled. They will be cached and may cause caching issues, various performance issues due to the higher load on your server because of the language alternatives requests. Now, let's move on to the security settings. We always start with these settings because Liferay is pretty good in social features. A lot of people, all of your users, by default, can have their own blogs, their own layouts, private or public layouts. And that's not really good for an enterprise setup because you do not want your users on your public site to show what they are eating currently. So we try to lock down our portal a bit, not allowing people to add content to our portal we have no control over. I would like to explain the highlighted properties now. The default role name for every newly created user is by default is user and power user. Now, we usually lock that down to user and assign role-based permissions after we created the users and do not leave power users edit content, create various sites. We disable public and private layouts, of course. That's something we already do. And disable all the auto-login hooks in the portal. There's a lot of hooks, of course, and I will talk about them a bit later. And I included only one authenticator, which has its own property in the portal, the OpenID out-enabled. A lot of these authenticators can be disabled and enabled with one property, but almost all of them, mainly the single sign-on properties, use 2 configurations. One hook in the auto-login hook setting, and one setting to enable and disable that authenticator. Now, enabling and disabling authentication can be done in the control panel. However, auto-login hooks is not enabled and disabled on the control panel, but you have to add it in the Portal X properties and, of course, restart your configuration, your application server to get them enabled. So always check, if you use a new authentication method, whether the auto-login hook related to that authenticator is enabled in your portal. We also set the redirect mode to domain, because usually our portal does not reside on the same IP address that requests come in. I will explain that a bit later, because it's an architectural setting. If you have redirect problems in your portal, always check whether these security settings affect your redirect, because the portal will not allow redirect to outside IP addresses or domain names outside of your normal domain. It has another setting. I will switch back to that. Because there is a redirect URL domains allowed setting also. If you leave it empty, it means all of the domains can be accessed to redirect from your portal. Setting it to anything else, to all of your hosts and domains, will cause that only redirects to these domains will be allowed from the portal. Now, there are two simple settings for header information, which is usually it is a good idea to not disclose what exact version you use on your server. These are usually considered information leak problems, and a lot of auditing, security auditors will usually have a hard time with you if you do not disable that. These options are there, you can disable them, no problem there. I included HTTP-only cookie names because it can help developers access cookies from JavaScript code if they would like to use it, because by default, all cookies set from portlets or servlet filters or whatever says HTTP only, so they are only accessible by the request and not from JavaScript. Now, let's see a simple architecture. It is a quite simple image, but it displays all the layers we usually consider. All of the enterprise setups consist of these layers. There is some kind of variation. There can be more proxy servers, less database servers. Servers can be merged, but the general architecture is always the same. Now let's see all these layers one by one. The first and probably the most important layer in our enterprise setup is the proxy layer. We always have something in front of the portal, whether be that an Apache HTTPD or something else, or just a simple load balancer. We always have something which directs traffic to our application servers from the client. Now, this layer is quite important because this can change how clients access our portal, because every part of the request coming from the client can be changed by the proxy server. It is not unusual to have various configurations. For example, a request coming from the client in HTTPS, but then directed to the portal through HTTP. Because of IDS systems want to track the traffic or something like that, so internal traffic may not be encrypted. That's a common setup, and there can be problems when you just rely on the request itself to generate URLs. Because when the portal is reached through HTTP, of course, the portal will think that the client uses HTTP, so maybe I will switch to that and generate URLs through HTTP. So after the first request, you already lost a secure connection because every other URL will be generated through HTTP. Now, all of these mismatches in configuration and request can be handled on the proxy server and should be handled on the proxy server side or on the application server side. All of the application servers have some methods to check whether the client really uses that address, whether the application server is accessed through a proxy layer. And they can always be changed. For example, in WebLogic, you can enable the WebLogic plugin module by checking a checkbox in the administration console. In Tomcat, you can change the connector settings to include explicitly for an HTTP connector that it actually uses the HTTPS protocol and set the secure factor true, which will make the application server think that it's a secure connection, although it is not. However, if everything else fails, there are some settings which you can set in your portal property file to change how the portal generates URLs. The first is the portal proxy path, which actually prefixes every generated URL with a fixed prefix. And that will be added by the portal automatically, and it will be accessed without a prefix, of course. The only drawback is that it is only a prefix. You cannot change passes, for example, with rewrite in the HTTPD. You can also set the HTTP and HTTPS port to something other than -1 to force the portal to generate URLs with these port settings. You can also change the web server host, of course, which will be set into the domain part of the URL. But these are fixed settings to actually use virtual host handling, because every URL will be generated with that domain regardless on what domain the first request came through. You can always set the web server protocol, of course. That's our last part, to HTTP or HTTPS, of course. But with this way, you cannot mix protocols on your portal. You cannot use HTTP or HTTPS at the same time. After the first request, the client will be redirected to the protocol you set here. There are some application server settings which I would like to share with you. There are a lot of things you can configure on the application server side, so I only highlighted a few of that because there are various settings for WebLogic, JBoss, WebSphere, and other application servers out there which affect how they are handling requests or various parts of your portal deployment. The auto-deploy unpack var is usually used to unpack deployed applications somewhere into the directory in the application server, so you can change something in it without having to unpack and repack it again. There are some settings to whether copy logging jar or whether log4j jar into your application, or you use a completely different mechanisms for log handling. That can be done. You can disable auto-deploy completely on this level. This is a good thing for public portals because probably you already do your deployment somewhere else, for example, in an administration server or somewhere else. And I highlighted two of the settings which affect how caches are handled in the portal. It is not strictly an application server settings, but it can affect how your portal behaves in various circumstances. We always pull them out, these files, from the standard locations in the portal EMPL jar. We pull them out because sooner or later, we always have to change how caching is done in the portal. There are a lot of good sensible defaults, but with an application with 50,000 rows, you probably won't do much caching if your cache's maximum size is set to 10,000. Because there will be a lot of cache flushes, evictions, or even there will be cases where a finder result does not even fit in the cache. So you select 20,000 rows from the database and it does not get into the cache, so you have to do that again without cache usage the next time. It is always a good idea to already think about that. You have to change that file later. These are the database settings again. There is not too much to say about databases. There are a lot of configuration options, also for various database vendors. You might want to change, for example, transaction level, access. I only highlighted two. These are always set if you use the portal provided connection pool mechanism. One of them, for example, CCPO or DBCP to connect to the database. If you use a data source, that's of course, you cannot configure that. That's already on the application server administrator side, so he may decide how to handle configurations. But the two most used or changed options are always the maximum pool size, no matter how it's called, and sometimes the maximum idle time your connection will stay in the pool before it's actually closed. On a high volume site, you probably can lower this setting to release database resources as soon as they are not needed. You can lower it to 5 minutes or something like that. It will change a little, but because there are a lot of requests, probably your pool will always be warm and don't have to change that. The maximum pool size, however, is a bit trickier. It's always set to 100 by default, but some database servers do not allow that amount of connection to be used in parallel. It will not come out at first. You will see that the portal is ticking at 10 connections, 15 connections at maximum, but when the load reaches a high level on your application server, the database connection count will go up, until it reaches the maximum pool size or the maximum connection count allowed by your database server. And if it reaches the second sooner than the other, it can lead to timeouts, of course, failed requests, because the database pool will think that it can acquire a connection, but actually it cannot. It will cause exceptions in the logs, of course, and sooner or later, the portal or the data source handler will mark the whole connection pool dead, because it could not acquire connections 5 times, 4 times, or multiple times. It is always good to slower the request serving than fail completely. Of course, that behavior can be changed also by options, so maybe not, for example, DBCP will not die on you if you set the settings properly, but by default, they are all set to die sooner or later than to exhaust data source resources. So always check whether you can go on the database size as high as you set this value on the pool. Database layer settings, that's what I was talking about, so we can skip now. And now we reached a quite interesting part, it's cluster settings. Of course, no enterprise application deployment can do without cluster settings. It is hard to get right, quite error-prone, but always have to be done somehow. This is also a template, so it may not suit your needs or will not work as you think, but this is the default we usually use for cluster setup. Of course, I highlighted the cache management resources which are used in the clustered environment. That's the same I was telling you before, but for clustered installations, of course. And the cluster link auto-detect address made the first setting because in a default or common enterprise environment, you probably have a completely different interface for communicating internally to your database server or the other nodes of the portal than the one you use for communicating with the proxy servers or directly with the client. So it's crucial to set this auto-detect address to a port and address which is always reachable to all of the nodes in your portal. and which points to a route in the network where you really want to route your traffic through or for the interconnect communications of your cluster. We move all of our cache configurations to JGroups, all of our communications from the default RMI configuration, because JGroups is a bit more flexible when you set network settings or various fine-tuning. You have to do various fine-tunings. It is easier to do in JGroups. By default, the Liferay portal is configured for cluster settings for multicast communication between the nodes. This, I do not want to talk about that much about it. You can set various addresses, ports. The only thing which is crucial in a multicast environment that only one cluster uses the same address. This is not always the case. Sometimes multicast addresses and ports or multicast traffic can go through firewalls or go through from one environment to another. Maybe you have a user acceptance test environment or a development environment or your production environment, of course. And maybe they can reach each other through multicast. That's not bad, because it can work, of course. But there is a little problem. The first thing you will notice that performance is not the same, because two nodes are constantly synchronizing the caches of each other, and one node constantly drops data which should not be dropped because it received the multicast request to flush, for example, journal article service caches or other sides. So always make sure, and it will not show in the logs. You will not notice that there is something wrong until you install notification portlet, but that's a completely different problem. So always make sure that you can use that multicast address you assign to the setting exclusively for that node. If you are unsure, move to unicast communication. That's not good for high servers count the clusters, because it is a constant communication between all the nodes. So that will not work easily. I get this default TCP configuration from the groups jar file. It is in the root of that file. You have to customize it a bit, and then you can use all of that for cache communication, cluster link, and other configuration options. And now we enable cluster settings, the replication. Replication is always done between the nodes, but by default, caches are only synchronized and not replicated. With cluster link enabled, it will enable the Quartz system to be set into the cluster mode, so only one node runs one job at one time, so your jobs will not run onto each other. It will turn on index replication if you use Lucene. This will make a system, when it starts up, to load the index from the other node which already has it and it's already alive. This will synchronize at first, and then you can replicate, of course, the writes to this cache. It is not needed if you use other settings. What is crucial that you set portal instance HTTP port. It is not the port used by the proxy. It is the HTTP port of the application server, which we use to synchronize this data set through HTTP among the nodes. And now I have a few seconds for that. Portal properties can always be easily set in the when you start your application or start your deployment. It starts up easily, but after you change something in the control panel, it is written to the portal preferences database entries. So after that, you cannot change the settings through the portal X properties. This is sometimes quite confusing for both operators and developers, because they set something in the control panel, and so later someone tries to change that into the portal properties file, and it will not work. So if something once set in the portal preferences, it will always take precedence over what you set in the portal X properties file. Not everything can be set there. Something only can be changed in the portal properties. Something only can be changed. The only thing that is tricky that once you save, for example, the authentication panel in the control panel, it will save the data from all of the tabs which are there. So if you have OpenID authentication disabled on one of the tabs, it will be written to the database and it cannot be changed later in the portal property. Now, I won't have time for that. And now, let's see a few questions. Short questions that I will be, of course, available at our booth. So if you have a longer one, we can talk about it later.
Yeah, we have a mic going around.
Okay, we have a mic. Over there is a question.
Work? Does it? Okay. It's not really a question, just a remark. It's not that they cannot be changed or overridden for a preference. It's that they cannot also be removed. There's no UI to remove them from the database.
Yeah,
you have to do it by hand.
Yes, that's true. You cannot remove a setting. Once it's set to true or false, you cannot make that unwritten into the database. That's true.